one.
All right, guys, so we're going to start with the weight acceptance phase. So during the initial phase of gait, if I'm talking about my right limb being in initial contact, okay, I'm going to be heel contact, my right leg. The kinetics of this is more of a planar flexor moment. So the ground reaction force is posterior to the joint, and my tibialis anterior is working in this to control that plantar flexor moment. Now, when we go to the knee, the muscle activation switches to the quadricep. So my knee is relatively straight. I have about 0 to 5 degrees of flexion, and this is in a flexor moment. Now, when we go up to the hip is when my hip is also in a flexor moment, but my gluteus maximus and my hamstrings are the muscles that are working here. In terms of the amount of degrees happening here is about 20 degrees of flexion. Now, when we look at the pelvis, the focus of this is to have forward rotation, which allows me to take a bigger step length in this position. And I have about 5 degrees of forward rotation, and my gluteus medius is a muscle that's activating here. In terms of my trunk, the muscle activation is in the erectors, and it's just to keep my trunk upright so it's in an erect state. Now, when we switch to the next phase, we're going into a loading response. So at the ankle, my foot is going to be flat. This is a critical event, and this allows me to absorb energy and properly transfer it right. I'm going to be in a planar flexor moment, but my tibialis anterior is the one that's activated. This is about 5 degrees of planar flexion. Now we go into the knee. My quadriceps are still active, but we're still in a flexor moment. This is a point of another critical event. So this is controlled knee flexion, and this allows for shock absorption during this loading response. At the knee, I have about 15 degrees of flexion as well. Now, when we go to the hip is when we also have another critical event in the loading response, and that's for hip stability. We're still in a flexor moment, and the gluteus maximus and hamstrings are still the main muscles activated with still around 20 degrees of flexion. We still have the forward rotation in the pelvis, and the gluteus maximus, medius is the muscle that's activated here, as well as the trunk extensors are helping me keep erect in this position.
Great. So I'm going to cover our single limb support stance. So I'm also going to use my right leg as the reference limb. So for the first thing, it's going to look a little bit like this. My reference limb is my right leg. Starting from the ankle, we're going to have a 5 degrees of dorsiflexion. So your gastroc soleus is going to be activated to keep that the pressure through your foot on the ground. So this is actually a critical event of the tibial advancement. So I'm with that gastroc preventing myself from collapsing like that. My knee is going to be in either 0 to 5 degrees of flexion, so very little activation of the knee here. And then my hip is actually going to be in 0 degrees of flexion, so all my weight is going straight through that joint right there. The pelvis is we're going to have 0 rotation because I'm going to be completely in the frontal plane with that pelvis. And then we're going to have 7 degrees of drop on that contralateral side. So not my right side, but my left side. And then the next one is going to be terminal stance. So once I pass through this, I'm going to come all the way out like this. So my reference limb, once again, the right. So we're going to be in 10 degrees of dorsiflexion of the ankle at this stance. The heel of my ankle is on the bottom of the floor. The gastroc soleus is going to be activated, and we're going to have a critical event of ankle dorsiflexion with heel rise. When you move up to the knee, once again, just 0 to 5 degrees flexion, so not much bend in the knee there. And then the hip, we're going to have our maximum extension right here in 20 degrees of extension. And our pelvis is going to be rotated back and then anterior tilted on the right side. That's going to give us the maximum amount we can extend this limb. And then on the contralateral side, we're also going to have that 7 degrees and drop. And then during both of these, pelvis stances, the gluteus medius is the one that's preventing that contralateral hip drop. And then our trunk in both of these stances is going to be erect.
Okay, so now we are moving into pre-swing. So at this point, my reference limb, which is my right limb, has shifted weight onto the opposite side, which is the left limb, but the reference limb is still on the ground. It's just not holding any weight. We have, at the ankle, we have 15 degrees of plantar flexion. Our gastroc and soleus are firing, and this is a dorsiflexion moment. This is actually going to be a critical event of rapid ankle plantar flexion, and this is going to allow ground clearance as you're moving on to the next phase. Then as we go to the knee, you're going to have 40 degrees of knee flexion with a flexor moment occurring. This is another critical event of the passive knee flexion, 240, and this is allowing that swing limb advancement and additionally achieving that clearance from the ground as well. As we move up to the hip, we are in 10 degrees of hip extension. The muscles firing are the rectus femoris, the adductor longus, and the iliopsoas, and this is an extensor moment. As we go to the pelvis, we're going to have a 4-degree anterior tilt, which is allowing that hip extension as well. And then we go to the trunk, and our extensors and abdominals are firing here.
Okay, and so the next step is going to be the initial swing. So my right leg is going to be the reference limb. So that puts my left leg in mid stance. And so in this phase, I'm in about 5 degrees of plantar flexion at the ankle. And there's going to be muscle activation from my tibialis anterior. And during this phase, my reference limb is also not on the ground, unlike the pre-swing phase. And so moving up at the knee, we have an increase of knee flexion to about 60 degrees and 15 degrees at the hip. And this is for limb clearance. And moving up at the trunk, we have our trunk extensors active along with our abdominal muscles. And there's also no rotation happening at the pelvis.
And lastly, we're going to move on to the second half of the swing phase, the latter end, and that consists of mid-swing and terminal swing. So I'm going to start in mid-swing, and the most important characteristic of this one is that my tibia is going to be vertical to the ground. I'm using my right leg as my reference limb. In this, we're going to have no ground reaction force since my leg is off the ground, but my tib anterior is going to be activated to start dorsiflexing my ankle. So this is going to help with limb clearance, and this is also going to help return back to neutral so I can prepare for my next cycle. And then next, moving to the knee, my hamstrings are going to start to activate in this mid-swing phase. And this is to decelerate my tibia, just so I can have that controlled landing. My knee is going to be starting to extend. So it's going to go from 60 that we saw in that initial swing to 25 degrees of flexion in this mid-swing, and eventually to 0 to 5 full extension for that terminal swing. This extension is going to be caused by my quads. I have, again, no ground reaction force. My hamstrings are still active, but my hip is at max hip flexion in this initial, or in this mid-swing. And this is for, so I can start getting that maximal step length. I'm at a neutral pelvis and my abdomen is firing to keep my trunk erect. So this terminal swing, I'm going to start extending that limb. This is going to give me my adequate step length. My heel of my other limb would be coming off the ground, but I can't stand like that. So it's going to look like this. And then, so this is preparing for my next cycle. In this extension of this terminal swing, my pelvis is going to rotate forward to increase that step length even further. In order to achieve that, my glute med is going to activate, and my glute max is going to help stabilize that hip. And that is our gait cycle. All 8 phases.